A dead banker. A will rewritten hours before his demise. Coincidence or murder? Welcome to Rust Evidence. I am your host, Silas Wren. I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from today? Reading your comments is my favorite part of the day. Let's dive in. It had been raining all morning. The kind of persistent drizzle that never quite soaked you, only layered everything in a film of gray. The streets along Boulevard Haussmann shimmered under it, slick with the sheen of wet stone and flattened leaves. The windows of the cafe glowed like lanterns in the murk, but Maigret sat outside, under the canvas awning, his coat collar turned up and a cigarette burning quietly in his hand. He wasn't waiting for anything in particular. Not yet. Inside the cafe, waiters moved with sleepy precision. A woman in a green coat stirred her coffee too long. The corner booth was empty. It usually wasn't, and the tall man with the hound always passed by around now. Today he did. Maigret watched this absence as one might notice the missing tick-tick, a familiar clock. He sipped slowly from his demi-pression. The beer was lukewarm and a touch sour, the way it often was at this time of day. But he liked the weight of the glass, the way it settled in his hand like a habit. The letter was still in his pocket, unopened, technically, though he knew who it was from. The waxy envelope, the thin, curling script on the front. The lawyer's name escaped him for a moment, but not the smell of old paper and furniture polish that clung to such offices. Maître Caston, he remembered aloud, the syllables barely parting his lips. It had come that morning, tucked between circulars and a folded Le Figaro, addressed to him, not as chief inspector, but simply Monsieur Jules Maigret. No urgency, no official heading. Just a brief line from the concierge, left by a young man, said it was a personal matter, waited a few minutes, then left. Still, he hadn't opened it. He didn't need to. Not yet. Across the street, a boy on a bicycle nearly collided with a delivery man stepping out of a shop. The older man cursed under his breath. The boy shouted something back, laughter in his voice. Already pedaling away, Maigret lit another cigarette. It had been nearly 3 months since his last case. The type that leaves you tired in a particular way, not from the work, but from what it shows you about people. He hadn't minded the quiet that followed. His days had taken on a comfortable rhythm, rising late, shopping with Madame Maigret at the market, long lunches, old books revisited. But now, something had shifted. Nothing he could name, just that faint echo of something about to happen. He drew the letter from his coat pocket and slit it open with his thumb. Maître Caston requests your discretion and presence at 47 Rue des Batignolles, concerning the estate of Monsieur Émile Laurent, recently deceased. Details to follow. Laurent. The name was vaguely familiar. A banker, wasn't he? Retired, private, discreet. The kind of man whose obituary would be small, tasteful, and placed precisely 4 days after his death, out of courtesy to protocol rather than sentiment. Maigret folded the letter neatly and slipped it back into his pocket. The rain wasn't letting up. He finished his beer and stood, joints stiff from the cold damp. He didn't rush. He rarely did. Time, he always said, has a way of letting things come to the surface, if you don't disturb the water too much. And there was something about the letter. Not its contents, but its tone. Too polished, too careful. Like the voice of someone telling the truth, but watching your face while they do it. He lit another cigarette and started walking. Rue des Batignolles was a little over a kilometer away, enough distance to let the city speak to him. Not yet a crime, not yet a case. But Maigret felt it all the same. That subtle pressure behind the eyes, the quiet weight in the stomach, as if somewhere, someone had told a lie, and it had begun to stain the edges of the day. The concierge was a square woman with heavy ankles and a way of breathing that suggested resentment toward most visitors. She wore a gray sweater with a loose hem, and as she led Maigret up the narrow, well-polished staircase, she spoke without turning her head. He died in his sleep, quiet as you like. Just stopped breathing. The doctor said heart failure. But then these types, they always go that way, don't they? Neat. No fuss. Maigret nodded, brushing his hand along the wooden rail, worn soft by decades of hands. The stairwell smelled faintly of beeswax and old varnish, with a lingering edge of something more pungent, boiled cabbage perhaps, or liniment. Did he have visitors? Maigret asked softly. Now and then. One niece, her name slips me. And a young man, tall, nervous, came more often these past few weeks. Didn't give a name. They reached the 3rd floor. The concierge gestured to a door, with a brass number 3B, polished but dulled by time. You'll find Maître Caston inside. He said to send you up when you arrived. She turned without waiting for thanks. Maigret paused before knocking. The hallway was silent, carpeted in a faded runner with a fleur-de-lis pattern. Behind the door he imagined dim light, drawn curtains, a fire turned too low. These apartments always felt slightly airless, like no one had ever quite finished living in them. He knocked twice. The door opened at once. Inspector Maigret. The man asked, stepping aside. He was younger than expected, late 40s perhaps, with neat hair, dark-rimmed glasses, and a crisp grey suit that sat a little too formally on his frame. His smile was professional and tight. Maître Castan, thank you for coming. I realize this is somewhat unconventional. Maigret entered without comment, letting his eyes travel slowly across the room. The parlor was just as he'd pictured. Narrow, modestly furnished, and steeped in a dry, unused quiet. The kind of room where clocks ticked a little louder than they should. On a side table sat a half-empty decanter of Armagnac, 2 glasses, and an open book, La Revue Bancaire, dated 2 years prior. He turned back to Castan. What made you write to me, Maître? The lawyer's smile faltered. You'll understand once I show you this. He moved toward a small writing desk, opened the top drawer, and retrieved a sheaf of folded paper. Heavy stock. Pale blue. The handwriting was tight, even almost too neat. The second will, Castan said, found in Liron's desk drawer, dated 3 weeks before his death. Maigret took it gently, unfolding the pages. He read in silence. The wording was precise, legal, and yet something about it, the phrasing perhaps, or the list of beneficiaries, felt off. Names were unfamiliar, save for one, Juliette Leronde, niece. When he looked up, Castan had poured 2 fingers of Armagnac into a glass and handed it to him without asking. There's an older will, the lawyer added. More. Expected. The niece receives the apartment, modest savings, a painting. But this version? He tapped the blue paper. It names 3 additional individuals, none of whom we knew anything about. Until the young man appeared. Maigret leaned back. The one the concierge mentioned? Castan nodded. Came the day after the funeral. Claimed to be a friend of Monsieur Liron. Said he had every right to a portion of the estate. When I asked him to identify himself properly, he left. But not before he mentioned something that only someone close to the deceased could have known. What was it? He said, ask about the Thursday evenings. Then he smiled and left. The silence that followed wasn't heavy, not yet, but it had a texture to it, like a room bracing for a draft. Maigret sipped his almanac. It burned, slightly, not unpleasantly. Was there anything unusual about those evenings, he asked. Castan hesitated. I honestly don't know. Monsieur Liron was private. Very private. But toward the end, perhaps there was something. People don't change their wills for no reason, Maître, Maigret said quietly. Especially not men who've spent their lives controlling numbers. He rose and crossed slowly to the window. Outside, the drizzle continued, streaking the glass in crooked lines. I'll need the addresses of these new beneficiaries, he said without turning. Castan nodded, already opening his briefcase. And Maître? Maigret added as he glanced again at the folded will. Do you think Monsieur Liron died naturally? There was a pause. The doctor signed off. There was no inquest. There was no... That's not what I asked. The lawyer exhaled through his nose. No, I don't. Maigret tucked the will into his coat. A quiet death. An unexpected will. A stranger with a smile. And now, a Thursday evening. No one wanted to explain. The drizzle thickened into proper rain. As Maigret stepped back into the corridor, the door clicked shut behind him. Maigret kept the list in his inside coat pocket, folded once. 3 names, 3 addresses, all scribbled in Castan's careful, slightly slanted hand. The ink had smudged slightly, where the lawyer's wrist had passed over the paper. That sort of detail interested Maigret more than the names themselves. That faint sign of hesitation, of caution, or maybe even discomfort. The first address was on Rue Dame Raymond, north of Montmartre. The sort of street that led nowhere particular, where apartment buildings looked down on bakeries that had changed owners 3 times in 5 years. Maigret didn't go there immediately. Instead, he walked. The rain had thinned to mist. Paris, in that in-between light of mid-afternoon, looked peeled back and uncertain, like a stage before the curtain rises. At the corner of Rue de Dames, he stopped at a tabac and ordered a sandwich and a beer. He read through the will again while he ate, crumbs of bread collecting on the tabletop like pale sawdust. The names repeated themselves like a low drumbeat. Jean-Marie Charrier, 47 Rue Cécile d'Anjou, 18 Rue Maurice Collin, 5 Passage Legendre. None had titles. No cousin, no long-time friend. No legal designations. Just names tied to amounts that were modest, but not symbolic. Enough to suggest significance, but not fortune. Enough to raise eyebrows. Juliette Leronde, the niece, remained the main beneficiary. The apartment, the savings, the collection of vintage banking medals. But these 3, strangers to Castan, unknown to the niece, shared the rest. A kind of quiet redistribution. He lit his pipe and let the smoke sit in the air before him. This, he thought, wasn't a criminal matter. Not yet, but it was a riddle, and Maigret had always preferred riddles to crimes. They came with fewer distractions. You listened more. By 4 o'clock he was standing in front of 47 Rue Dame Raymond. The building was modest and in good repair, with red shutters and a chipped doorbell panel. A woman's voice answered on the 3rd ring. Oui, Maigret. I'd like to speak with Monsieur Jean-Marie Charrier. There was a pause, then the buzz of the lock, and the door clicked open. The flat was on the 2nd floor, no elevator. The stairs were worn at the center, shallow scoops that revealed the path of years. Charrier opened the door himself. He was young, not quite 30, with a lean, angular face and eyes that moved too quickly. His shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, and he smelled faintly of turpentine. Are you police? He asked immediately. I'm here. About Monsieur Émile Leron, Maigret replied. He showed no badge, no papers, just his presence, which was often enough. Charrier's shoulders shifted slightly. I haven't done anything. Maigret didn't answer. Instead, he stepped past the threshold, not asking permission, but not forcing it either. The flat was small, a sitting room filled with canvases, some finished, some not. The air held the scent of oil paint and cheap tobacco. A kettle clicked faintly in the background. You're a painter? Maigret asked. Charrier hesitated. I try to be. Maigret walked slowly to a canvas near the window. A portrait, half-finished, of a middle-aged man, in profile. The lines were sharp, but the mouth had a slight tremor to it, the kind of detail that came from memory, not models. Is this him? Charrier said nothing. Then finally, yes. That's Leron. How did you know him? Charrier sat down in an old chair and pulled a cigarette from a tin. His fingers trembled slightly as he lit it. I met him at the Galerie Lemoine 3 years ago. He used to come on Thursday nights. Quiet. Always in the back. Did he buy your work? Once. Small piece. A still life. He said it reminded him of something. He paused. We talked now and then, about art, mostly. And weather. He wasn't friendly, not exactly. But he was curious. There was something private about him. And lately, we met twice in the past month. He asked me if I needed anything. I thought he meant money. I said no, but he left you something anyway. Charia nodded, as if ashamed. I don't know why. Migrate said nothing. He was looking at the portrait again. Was he ever here? He asked. Once. He looked at my canvases, said I should paint people I didn't know. Migrate's eyebrows rose slightly. He said strangers are the hardest to get right, because you only paint what you see. There was a silence between them then. Not uncomfortable, just present. What did you do on Thursday evenings? Maigret asked. Charia hesitated again. We met at the gallery sometimes, once or twice at a cafe on Rue Lepic. Just to talk. Anyone else there? Sometimes. Charia flicked ash into a saucer. A woman, short hair, glasses, older than me. I never caught her name. Maigret tucked that detail away. I may come back, he said. Charia didn't ask why. He just nodded, and Maigret let himself out. Outside, the street had emptied. A few drops clung to the windows. The city held that late afternoon hush, where everything seemed to pause just before evening settled in. He walked toward Rue Ordiner, where the second name waited. The building at number 18 was newer, post-war, with stiff balconies and curtains drawn uniformly. The intercom was broken. He rang 3 times before a voice answered, this time female and flat. Oui? Migrate. I'm looking for Madame Cécile d'Anjou. The pause was shorter this time. 3rd floor. Left. She answered the door in a navy cardigan and pressed slacks. Her glasses were thick-rimmed, her hair neatly pinned. She looked to be in her 50s. She did not smile. You're here about Emile. The use of his first name surprised Maigret. You knew him well. She stood aside. The apartment was clinical. Not cold, but efficient. A slight scent of lavender. I cleaned for him, she said. Every Thursday afternoon, for the past 8 years. Only Thursdays, he insisted. Maigret sat gently on the edge of a chair. The cushions didn't yield. He was polite, she said. Tidy. But he didn't speak much. I'd dust, change the sheets, make coffee. Then he'd leave at 5. Always at 5. Go where? She shook her head. He never said. I didn't ask. Did he ever have visitors? Not while I was there, but he began receiving calls in the last month. Short calls. I could hear his tone change after, quieter. Did you recognize any names? No, she paused, but he once muttered something when he thought I'd gone. You can't clean guilt, he said. Maigret didn't speak for a moment. He left you money, he said. She looked down. I know. Any idea why? She looked at him then, eyes sharp behind the glasses. I think he wanted to be remembered by someone who wouldn't pretend to love him. That answer stayed with Maigret as he left. He stepped out into the falling evening. The sky hung low, and the streetlights had begun to flicker on, one by one, like tired eyes struggling to stay awake. 2 names down. 2 lives touched quietly by a man no one had quite understood. The third, Maurice Collin, would wait for the next day. As Maigret walked back toward the scene, pipe tucked away and hands in his pockets, he felt again the tug of something not quite right. The will wasn't a gesture. It was a pattern, a message, not in words but in the lives it tried to bind together, and Thursday, somehow, was at its center. It was just after 8, the next morning, when Maigret stepped off the number 31 bus, his breath fogging lightly in the crisp spring air. Passage Ledgeret ran like a shadow between the backs of old buildings, near the edge of the 17th arrondissement, the kind of narrow way that never appeared on postcards. Laundry lines crisscrossed the alley overhead, and cats watched silently from iron balconies. Number 5 was a pale yellow building with a slanted roof, and an air of forgotten bureaucracy. A chipped plaque beside the door read, Maison des Anciens Fonctionnaires, retired civil servants' home. Maigret took in the small garden out front, where a single wooden bench sagged under the weight of damp leaves. Inside, the corridor smelled faintly of stewed vegetables and antiseptic. A woman behind a desk, her cardigan the color of mustard, looked up from her knitting. "I'm looking for Monsieur Maurice Colline." She gave a skeptical glance at his coat, his shoes, then shrugged. "Second floor. Room 7. He's awake by now." Room 7 was halfway down the corridor, a door painted a dull brown, with a brass number barely clinging to the surface. Maigret knocked once. A muffled cough came from inside, followed by slow, shuffling footsteps. The door opened a few inches. Maurice Colline was perhaps 70, with a loose shirt tucked carelessly into corduroy trousers. His gray hair stuck out at uneven angles, and his eyes had the faint pink rim of someone used to early mornings and insufficient sleep. "Yes," he said, his voice flat and cautious. "I'm Jules Maigret. May I come in?" Colline looked him over, hesitated, then opened the door without a word. The room was spare, but lived in. A narrow bed with military corners, a wooden table with neatly stacked papers, a clock that ticked too loudly. On the wall hung a single black and white photograph, 3 men in uniform, squinting into the sun. One of them was unmistakably younger Colline. "We were in the gendarmerie?" Maigret asked, nodding toward the photograph. Colline gave a small, dismissive grunt. "A lifetime ago. Inspector, Western Region." He gestured toward a chair. Maigret sat. Colline did not. "I suppose this is about La Ronde." Maigret lit his pipe and waited for Colline to continue. "He didn't. You were mentioned in his will," Maigret said quietly. "You knew him." "I knew of him." Colline said, "That's not the same." "No." A long pause. "We crossed paths. Once." That was enough. Maigret watched him. The stiffness in the man's frame wasn't simply age. It was defense. Where was that? In Angers. 1958. Maigret gave the faintest tilt of his head. "Go on." Colline exhaled, walked to the window, and opened it just a crack. The morning breeze stirred the curtain. "I was stationed there. Routine fraud case. Small time. Local bank manager fudging books. The kind of case no one talks about unless someone makes it a scandal. The man's name wasn't La Ronde then. He used another. He was working under someone else's credentials, clever, but not clever enough." "You arrested him?" "No. He was never officially charged." Colline turned back to face him. "But he knew I had seen through him. I think he saw it as a kind of bond." Maigret said nothing. He watched the older man carefully. "He left the city," Colline continued. "Reappeared years later in Paris. Respectable, tidy, never tried to contact me. Until last year." "What changed?" "I received a letter, no return address. It said only, 'You looked at me honestly once. That's rare. I owe you more than you know.' Then last week, Castan calls, says I've been named in the will. And you have no idea why." Colline gave a tight, ironic smile. "The strange thing is, I think it was gratitude." Maigret leaned back. "And what did you do with that letter?" "I kept it." He walked to the table, opened a drawer, and handed over a folded paper. The handwriting was unmistakable, the same tight loops and precise ink as in the second will. Maigret read it again slowly. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't even a plea. It was, in its own dry way, something closer to a benediction. And yet, beneath the careful words there was something else. The trace of a man trying to square a ledger that couldn't quite be balanced. "You ever see him after that?" Maigret asked, folding the letter neatly. "No. But I thought about him more than I'd like to admit." Maigret stood. He held out his hand. "Thank you, Monsieur Colline." Colline hesitated, then shook it. His grip was dry and firm. As Maigret stepped back into the hallway, he paused at the top of the stairs. The building, with its sagging carpets and smells of old soup and polish, felt heavier now. The kind of place where people waited for visitors, for letters, for the slow unraveling of time. Outside, the sky had begun to brighten. A small bird pecked at crumbs near the edge of the sidewalk. Maigret lit his pipe and walked with no great urgency. He'd spoken now to all three of the unexpected beneficiaries, and what emerged wasn't suspicion, but something quieter. A pattern of strange kindnesses. A banker who left pieces of himself scattered across lives that bore no relation to each other. Not family, not friends, just witnesses. He made his way back to Rue de Batignolles. The apartment remained sealed, the concierge watching from her glass booth as he climbed the stairs again to 3B. Inside, the room was unchanged. Maître Castan had left the keys for him on the desk, as agreed. Maigret sat in the armchair beneath the lamp and looked at the books on the shelf, the untouched dust on the windowsill. He let the silence speak. Then he noticed something. In the grate beside the armchair, beneath cold ashes, was a fragment of paper that hadn't fully burned. He knelt slowly. With tweezers from his coat, he lifted it free. Only a corner remained, but the letterhead was visible. Galerie Lemoine, Jeudi Artistique, Thursday Artistic Evenings. The phrase tugged at a loose thread in his mind. Thursday. Charrier had mentioned the gallery, so had Cécile Danjou. Thursday afternoons, then Laurent leaving at 5, and now the letterhead. Half-burned, discarded. Why would a man destroy an invitation? Or perhaps it had been more than that. A list, maybe. An agenda. He stood, brushing ash from his knees. From the hallway, the muffled sound of a vacuum cleaner echoed faintly. The concierge, tidying the edges of her realm. The flat felt different now. Not sinister, but laden, as if something had been lived in too long without being shared. He looked around once more and noticed the photograph above the mantel. Not family, not a portrait, just a group. 6 or 7 people seated at a long table in what appeared to be a gallery space. The setting was familiar, the expressions vague. Laurent sat at one end, half smiling, the only one looking directly at the camera. Maigret slipped the photograph from the frame and turned it over. On the back, in faint pencil, Jeudi, Avril. That was over 20 years ago. He pocketed it carefully. Back, on the street, the air had grown warmer. School children passed him, laughing, dragging their satchels. The drizzle was gone. The city was starting to live again. But Maigret felt it now. The case stirring properly, like a dog waking at the scent of something familiar. Not a murder, not a theft, but something tangled nonetheless. He needed to know more about those Thursday evenings, the gallery, the people in the photograph. He needed to speak with the niece. Juliette Laurent lived in the 15th arrondissement, not far from the Parc Georges Brassens. It was a quiet part of Paris, where elderly men fed pigeons on benches and the chimneys of former slaughterhouses stood like monuments to an older, grittier city. Her building was narrow and tall, with a black iron gate and a courtyard lined with neglected shrubs. Maigret rang the bell marked J. Laurent. To see. There was a long pause before the intercom crackled to life. Yes, Madame Laurent. This is Chief Inspector Maigret. May I have a word? A silence. Then a flat click. The door buzzed open. The apartment was orderly, low-ceilinged, and cool. Pale curtains filtered the sunlight into a vague gold that clung to the parquet floor. Juliette was a thin woman in her early 40s, with tired eyes and a woolen shawl pulled tightly over her shoulders, though it wasn't cold. She led him to a small dining room with a single pot of tea on the table and sat without offering it. "You're here about the will," she said. "Not a question. I'm here about your uncle," Maigret replied. Juliette gave the faintest of nods. "He died in his sleep. At peace, they said." "I hope that's true. He was never at peace when I knew him." Maigret lit his pipe. The silence lingered long enough to feel deliberate. "You were close. I visited once a week, Wednesdays. We had coffee. I cleaned a little, talked a little. He never said much, but he always thanked me. What did you talk about? She shrugged. Weather, groceries, the cost of fruit. He asked how I was. I answered. That was the ritual. And did you ever talk about his past? Her eyes met his now, clear, but reserved. Never, and I never asked. He had a sadness about him, the kind that feels like a wall. You learn not to knock. Maigret nodded slowly. Did he mention the other beneficiaries? Other. She stopped. Her expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes did. He left part of his estate to 3 others, Maigret said. Jean-Marie Chaujoret, Cécile d'Anjou, Maurice Collet. Juliette sat very still. I don't know them, she said softly. Are you sure? Yes. She poured herself a small measure of tea, but didn't drink it. He never spoke of friends or acquaintances. If he had a life outside our Wednesdays, I didn't see it. Do you know anything about Thursday evenings? She looked up, startled. He'd never let me visit on Thursdays, she said after a moment. Once I stopped by unannounced. It was early. I had a doctor's appointment nearby. He didn't answer the door. And after that, he called me, said I must never do that again. His voice, it wasn't angry, it was afraid. Angry. Maigret waited. I thought he might be ill, or hiding something. Did you ask? I never brought it up again. Maigret pulled a small envelope from his coat, the photograph from Laurent's mantel. He placed it gently on the table. This was taken in 1963. Do you recognize anyone? She studied it without touching it. Her face gave nothing away. No, not even him. I recognize him, yes, but not that version of him. He looks content. Maigret didn't press. He was watching her hands now, how they rested on the edge of the table, how the knuckles tightened when she spoke. She wasn't lying, but there was something held back, not out of guilt, but out of protection. For whom, he wasn't sure. Your uncle had a second will, he said, dated 3 weeks before his death. It left you the bulk of the estate, but it also split off parts to those 3 people. I was surprised when Maître Castan told me. You didn't contest it. I had no reason to. She paused. I didn't care about the money. What bothered me was not knowing why. Did he seem troubled lately? No. Quieter, perhaps. But he was always quiet. Maigret nodded slowly, then reached into his coat again and placed the burned fragment of the Galerie Lemoine letterhead beside the photo. He burnt this, but not the photo. Do you know the gallery? No. It hosted artistic evenings, Thursdays. A place where people could speak freely, painters, critics, collectors, small gatherings. Your uncle was part of them. She looked at the burned paper. He never mentioned art. I don't think he ever owned a painting. He did. He bought one from a young artist, quietly. She said nothing. Maigret studied her a moment longer. You said something earlier, he said. He was never at peace when I knew him. What did you mean? She looked out the window. Her voice was very soft now. I think he was running from something, or someone, or maybe just from himself. There was a darkness in him, but not cruelty. Just, what kind of shame? She looked back at Maigret. Her face was unreadable, the kind that never fully goes away. He nodded and stood. Thank you, Madame Laurent. As he reached the door, she said, Do you think he meant for you to find all this? Maigret paused, hand on the knob. No, he said. I think he meant for it to stay hidden, but he also knew someone might come looking anyway. She nodded. Then maybe that's the closest thing to peace he could find. He stepped out into the stairwell. The day had brightened slightly, a cool sun breaking through in patches. But Maigret didn't feel warmth. He felt the pressure of a mystery forming, not around an event, a crime or a scandal, but around a man's life. A man who had quietly tried to rewrite his ending. Back at headquarters, he sat in his office and laid the items out on his desk. The photograph, the burned letterhead, the will, and the note to Maurice Collet. He had a habit of arranging things in a circle, not for order, but to feel the silence between the items. The names were beginning to speak. Not loudly, but enough. Lecheren's Thursdays were no hobby. They were the heart of something. A life built in fragments. A collection of individuals who, for reasons still unclear, had been chosen to receive the pieces he left behind. What linked them wasn't affection, it wasn't even connection. It was observation. He didn't give to people he loved. He gave to people who had seen him in their own way, without judgment, without demand. Margaret struck a match and lit his pipe. He sat in the quiet of the room as smoke curled against the edge of the window. Something was still missing. A detail, a crack in the facade. And in that moment, as he stared at the photograph again, he saw it, a face partly obscured at the far end of the table. A woman, not fully in frame, only a sliver of profile. But Margaret knew that face. He'd seen it just this morning. Not in person. In a photograph in Maurice Collins' room, the black and white one. The same woman, the same jawline. The gallery, the police, the niece, the housekeeper. He stood up, suddenly certain of what had to come next. He needed to go back, not to Rue des Batignolles, to the Galerie Lemoine. The Galerie Lemoine sat at the quiet end of Rue Lepic, where the cobblestone still resisted the smooth ambition of asphalt. It looked more like a former bookshop than a gallery, narrow, with high windows fogged slightly from within, and lettering on the glass so faded you had to squint to read it. The sign said Galerie Lemoine, Est, 1951. A small bell jingled as Margaret pushed open the door. Inside, the gallery was almost too warm, filled with a stillness particular to places where little changes and even less sells. The walls were lined with a mix of old frames, amateur oils and watercolors too tasteful to offend and too timid to excite. Near the back, a woman of about 60 stood rearranging a stack of invitation cards with deliberate care. She looked up as Margaret approached. "Bonjour," she said with mild suspicion, then glanced instinctively at his shoes, a Parisian habit he always noticed. "Margaret," he said simply, "I'm not here for the art." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "We're not accepting submissions. I'm here about Asian." Something shifted in her face. Not quite surprise, not quite recognition, a name that still had weight. She said nothing, merely gestured toward a small wooden chair by the window. "He died," Margaret said, after sitting. "I read it in the paper," she said, "in the notices, but they got his name wrong. Or rather, they used the name he died with, not the one he lived under." "You knew the other name?" She nodded. "He was one of ours, from the old Thursdays." "Thursdays," Margaret repeated, watching her closely. "Jeux des artistiques," she said, with a faint, ironic smile. "Though in truth we did more talking than painting. It started in the late 50s. A few of us, artists, critics, bureaucrats with a flair for charcoal, met every week here. Thursday evenings, wine, conversation, a sketch or two. We fancied ourselves bohemians. And Laurent, he came later, sat quietly at first. We thought he was a patron, but he never bought. Not then. He listened, always listened." Margaret nodded. "Did he talk?" "Not easily, but when he did, it was always personal. Not dramatic, just stripped of decoration. He didn't flatter, didn't entertain. He observed. Did anyone know his past? No one asked, and he never offered." She hesitated. "Except once." "What happened?" "He brought a drawing, a rough sketch, a man in uniform, sitting alone. It was angry. Not the drawing, but the hand behind it. When someone asked who it was, he said someone who mistook silence for virtue. Then he folded it and never brought it again." Margaret said nothing for a moment. He looked around the room. "I found a letterhead, half burned, from this gallery." She raised her eyebrows. "He kept them." "We haven't sent invitations in years. Most of the original group has either moved away or died. There's a photograph." He withdrew it from his coat and placed it on the table between them, taken in 1963. She leaned over it slowly. Her eyes passed over each face with quiet deliberation. Then her expression stopped. "That's me," she said, almost surprised. "Goodness, look at the hair. And that's Pierre, the poet. He died in 71. And Thérèse. She ran the summer workshops, always wore that scarf." "Who's this?" Margaret asked, pointing to the woman at the far end, her face partially obscured. Her voice dropped slightly. "Madeleine Carreau. She was a teacher, literature, I think, at the lycée in the 11th. Very reserved, but she had a sort of loyalty to Laurent. She sat with him often. Do you know what became of her?" She hesitated. "She stopped coming in the mid-60s. Then, I don't know. There were rumors that she moved south or fell ill. I haven't seen her since. Do you remember a man named Maurice Collin? Yes. Her voice changed, firmer now. Police, gendarmerie, visited once, asked a few polite questions. Laurent vanished after that. For nearly a year, when he came back, something in him had changed. In what way? He was gentler, less guarded, but also more selective. He spoke mostly to Madeleine, and he stopped sketching. Maigret looked again at the photograph. Do you know why he left money to 3 people? None of them family. She exhaled slowly. Laurent never spoke of family, but he was sentimental in his own way. I think he valued moments more than people. If someone said something that struck him, he remembered it. If someone offered kindness without agenda, he filed it away like a private currency. Maigret stood. Do you have any old correspondence? Letters? Notes he might have sent? She gave a tight smile. We were not a club of record keepers, Inspector. We drank table wine and argued about brushstrokes, but there might be something in the archives. Waiting in the ark, she disappeared into a back room. The smell of old paper and linseed oil following behind her. After a few minutes she returned with a box no larger than a shoe box. She placed it on the table and opened it slowly. Inside were postcards, sketches, yellowing pamphlets, and an old appointment ledger with penciled initials. She handed him a card, a torn edge, a typewritten note. No name. Some truths are best understood in quiet rooms over time. Thank you for the silence you gave me. The signature was a small E. Could be anyone, she said, but it sounds like him. Maigret pocketed the card. Do you have an address for Madeleine Caro? She frowned. None recent, but someone might. Jeanne Morin. She was Madeleine's friend, also part of the group. She runs a bookshop now, near Canal Saint-Martin. I'll find it. He was nearly at the door when she called after him. You're not investigating a crime, are you? Maigret turned slightly. Not yet, but you suspect one. He thought for a moment, then answered truthfully. I suspect a secret. Back outside, the sky had clouded again, and the breeze carried a chill from the north. Maigret paused on the steps of the gallery, pipe in hand, letting the wind stir his coat. People passed by without urgency. The shops were just opening. The world moved forward, but Maigret was thinking backward now. To the photograph, to Madeleine Caro, to the wait behind an old man's gifts. The gallery had confirmed what he'd begun to suspect, that Laurent hadn't given to those who comforted him, but to those who had seen him, truly seen him, in the places he had least expected to be visible. He began walking toward the canal. Madeleine was no longer just a name. She was a thread, pulled loose from a decades-old tapestry. Somewhere in her quiet life, a truth had been buried. Perhaps a grief, perhaps a mercy, and Maigret, in his usual patient way, was going to find out which. The bookshop sat just off Quai des Valmy, its awnings striped and sagging, the display window filled with dusty hardbacks and one cracked bust of Balzac. There was a small chalkboard on the sidewalk that read, Livre d'occasion, café au fond, second-hand books, coffee in the back. It was the kind of place that belonged to a slower world, and Maigret had always found those the easiest to navigate. Inside, the scent of old paper wrapped around him like a coat. It was warmer than expected, quiet, but not dead. A soft rustle of pages, a murmur of jazz on a distant radio. A young woman with blue hair and chipped nail polish looked up from the counter and gave a brief, disinterested smile. I'm looking for Jeanne Morin, Maigret said. The girl gestured with her chin toward the rear. Through the stacks. She'll be in the back room. She doesn't move much. He followed the cramped passage of books, each turn narrower than the last, until the shelves gave way to a low-ceilinged room, lined with paperbacks. At the far end sat a woman behind a worn writing desk, hunched slightly, a cardigan wrapped loosely over her shoulders. She had the posture of someone who had spent decades leaning over books. She was scribbling something in a ledger with a fountain pen. Madame Morin. She looked up slowly. Her eyes were sharp, unexpectedly so, and seemed to measure Maigret before he even spoke. You're not here for Balzac, she said. No. You're not a student. Not dressed for it. No. Police? Maigret smiled faintly. Retired. Mostly. My name is Maigret. That earned the faintest lift of her eyebrows. She gestured to a wooden chair beside the desk. So, what brings a man like you to a place like this? A name. Madeleine Caro. Her pen paused mid-sentence. She set it down and leaned back, folding her hands in her lap. I haven't heard that name aloud in years. But you remember her. Some people stay even when they leave. She studied him. You're not chasing a crime. You're chasing a ghost. I'm not sure yet. She nodded, as if that made more sense than any other answer. We were friends, she said. Not close, not like sisters, but companions of a kind. We attended the same lectures, shared copies of La Nouvelle Critique. Then the gallery, the Thursdays. She was close to Émile Legrand. Now Morin's gaze sharpened. Closer than most. How would you describe it? She tapped a fingernail against the desk. They had a quiet understanding. Two people who didn't need to fill silence. She wasn't flirtatious, if that's what you're asking. She wasn't even warm. But there was a gentleness in her when he was near. Do you know what became of her? She left suddenly. 65, maybe 66. Didn't say goodbye. Just stopped appearing. At first we assumed illness or heartbreak. But no obituary came. No news. I heard she moved to Lyon. That was gossip, though. Nothing more. Maigret took out the photograph again. Morin glanced at it and nodded, her finger resting briefly on Madeleine's shadowed face. She never liked photographs. Said they were dishonest. Did she and Legrand share a secret? Don't we all? Morin gave a wry smile. But yes, I think they did. Not a romantic one. Something older. Something moral. Maigret leaned forward. Moral? Legrand used to say, when he spoke at all, that truth wasn't something you tell. It's something you carry. Madeleine carried something. You could see it in the way she spoke. In what she didn't say. Do you think she's alive? Morin tilted her head. I hope so. She was the kind of person who deserved to grow old. Even if quietly. Maigret paused, then asked, do you have any letters from her? Anything with a return address? Renan stood with a faint groan and moved to a filing cabinet tucked beneath the back window. She rifled through thin envelopes and cards, muttering to herself. Finally, she pulled out a pale green envelope, unopened, tied with a faded ribbon. She sent this to the shop, 1977. No message inside. Just a clipping about a painting exhibit in Lyon. No return address, but the postmark, she turned it over, is Saint-Cyr-au-Mont-d'Or. Maigret took it gently. He studied the postmark, the curl of the handwriting. It matched the burned gallery letterhead. Tight, careful, female. I think she may have witnessed something, he said. Long ago, something to do with Legrand, or perhaps something Legrand did himself. Morin met his eyes. Then you'll need to go to Saint-Cyr. I plan to. Be kind to her, Morin added softly. If she's still there, if she's still alive, some people carry their truths longer than they should. Maigret nodded. He stood, tucked the envelope inside his coat, and extended his hand. Thank you, Madame Morin. She shook it, her grip unexpectedly firm. As he stepped back through the aisles of books, he thought of that phrase, something moral. It had a weight to it. Not sin. Not crime. Something more difficult. A misstep of principle. A silence taken too long. A choice once made and then regretted across the year. Outside, the canal shimmered with reflected light, and boats creaked gently against their moorings. Maigret stopped at a bench beneath a chestnut tree and lit his pipe. Around him, Parisians moved through their afternoon with that curious blend of purpose and detachment. The world churned, but he sat still. Legrand had rewritten his will to honor those who had witnessed him. Not supported, not loved, but quietly seen what others had ignored. The young artist, who heard his loneliness, the housekeeper, who offered no questions, the retired inspector, who recognized the man beneath the disguise, and perhaps Madeline, who had seen something else. Something that had changed them both. Saint Simenon, a town with old walls, older secrets. Maigret would go. Not as a policeman. Not anymore. But as a man who knew what it meant to carry the unspoken. He rose slowly, exhaled a ribbon of smoke, and walked toward the nearest cab stand. The train to Lyon left early, its compartments half empty, filled with murmurs, the rustle of newspapers, and the faint scent of railway coffee. Maigret preferred trains to cars. They gave him time to think. Out the window, the countryside passed in softened tones, wet fields, shuttered barns, pale sky stitched with wires. A land that seemed paused. Saint Simenon lay just northwest of Lyon, a quiet village, draped over the side of a hill, its stone houses pressed into the slope like weathered books on a shelf. Maigret arrived by taxi just after noon. The driver, a lean man with a heavy scarf, gave him a skeptical glance as he stepped out. "Not much to see here, monsieur." "I'm not here to see," Maigret said, and paid him. He asked at the mairie first. The clerk, a young woman with practical glasses and a chipped coffee mug on her desk, raised an eyebrow at his request. "Madeline Caro?" She tapped at the keyboard with 2 fingers. "Retired. Registered under that name. Lives on Rue de la Vallée. Number 12. Assisted living but independent." She handed him a small map of the village. "She doesn't get visitors." The house was small and square, perched near the top of a gently climbing road lined with plane trees. The shutters were open. A curtain moved as he approached. Then still, he knocked once. The door opened not quite halfway. She was thinner than in the photograph. Her hair, now white, was pinned back, simply. She wore a gray cardigan and a long skirt. Her eyes, dark and tired, met his without surprise. "You've come a long way, Inspector. You remember me?" "No. But I expected someone eventually. May as well be you." She opened the door wider. He stepped inside. The house was modest and clean. A wood-burning stove crackled faintly in the corner. On the wall hung a single framed sketch, a man in profile, sharply drawn, unsmiling. Maigret knew that face. Émile Lerond, younger, or at least softened. "Tea?" she asked. "If it's no trouble." They sat in a small kitchen, where everything had a place. She moved slowly, deliberately. The kettle clicked as it heated, and she prepared the cups without conversation. "Sugar?" "No, thank you." They drank for a moment in silence. The wind stirred the trees outside, tapping gently on the windows. "I've seen the photograph," Maigret said. She didn't react. "You were close to him." "Yes," she said. "Closer than anyone, though not in the way people assume. He left something behind, not just money. He left a pattern, a trail." Her eyes flicked to him. He would hate that. He spent his life erasing trails. Why? She set her cup down. "Because he believed you could start over, not from redemption, from refusal. He refused to be what he once was, and yet, he never escaped it." "Did you know him before the gallery?" "You know him before the gallery?" She nodded. "Not in person, but I knew what he had done." Maigret waited. "He falsified documents," she said. "Back in the 50s, banking certifications. He assumed the identity of a colleague who had died suddenly. No family, no ties, just a name. He used it to apply for a transfer, then disappeared into a modest position in Paris." "And you knew this?" "I worked in the archives," she said. "In Angers. I came across a duplicate entry one day. Same dates. 2 identities. It was subtle, almost nothing. But I followed it. You could have reported him." "I almost did. But I met him. Not deliberately. He came into the library one day. I recognized his manner. Careful, respectful. I spoke to him casually. Then more often, I asked small questions. I wanted to know if he knew he was living a lie, and he did. Completely. But he also believed it was a better life than the one he'd left. Migret sipped his tea. And you kept his secret. I did. Why? She looked at him then fully. The voice was quiet, but steady. Because some men are dangerous, and some are only guilty. He didn't answer. Outside, the wind had grown stronger. I became part of the Thursday group, not long after, she said. He never knew how much I knew, but I think he suspected. And in time he trusted me, anyway. That was his way. If someone saw him and didn't run, he considered them worthy. And then you left. Yes. Why? She stood and walked to the window, looking down the slope where the village rooftops shimmered with old rain. Because I stopped being useful to his reinvention. I reminded him. I didn't intend, but it was there, between us. In every silence. Maigret rose slowly. He left you nothing. She smiled, faintly. He left me the chance to forget. But you didn't. No. A pause, but I learned to live with remembering. Maigret stepped beside her. What do you think he wanted with the will? She answered without hesitation. To acknowledge the ones who let him live as the man he pretended to be. Not forgiveness. No. Just presence. They stood there a moment longer. Then she turned and held out a small parcel, thin, wrapped in brown paper. He sent this. Years ago. I never opened it. Maigret took it. She nodded. He opened the paper carefully. Inside was a drawing, charcoal on heavy stock. A room, dimly lit. A man at a desk, alone, his back turned. And behind him, a window. In the window, a face, a woman's face, looking in. She looked away as he examined it. I think he knew, she said quietly, that in the end we are seen by others more clearly than by ourselves. Maigret returned the drawing to its paper. He placed it in his coat. I won't trouble you again. You're not a trouble, she said. At the door, she looked at him one last time. Tell them, she said, tell the others, if they ask, that he was a man who died trying to live truthfully, even if the truth wasn't his. Maigret nodded. Then he stepped into the grey light. As he walked down the hill, the bell from the village chapel rang once, not for any reason, just the hour, but it felt in its own quiet way, like a release. The return to Paris was uneventful. Rain slid down the train windows in long, uninterested lines. Maigret sat alone in a second-class compartment, his coat draped over his knees, the brown paper package resting beside him like an old companion. He didn't reread Madeleine's words in his head. He didn't need to. They had folded into his memory with the same calm certainty as her tea-making, her silence, her sadness. He lit a pipe only once. When the conductor wasn't looking, the smoke seemed to disturb the still air of the carriage. But not his thoughts. He wasn't troubled, only settled. A shape had begun to form in the mystery, and it was not the shape of guilt, not in the traditional sense, no murder, no theft, but something was still unfinished. A question that hovered just behind the story he now understood. Laurent had orchestrated the end of his life with care. The new will, the chosen names, even the half-destroyed clues, deliberate but incomplete. The kind of incomplete that wanted to be noticed, wanted to be interpreted. Back in Paris, dusk was falling. The lamps along Boulevard Saint-Michel blinked on one by one, casting a fragile warmth over the wet streets. He took a taxi straight to Quai des Orfèvres. His office, though no longer truly his, remained available, a quiet favor from the bureau's newer generation, who still treated him with a mixture of reverence and reluctance. Inspector Lognon was leaning over a report at the far end of the corridor when Maigret passed. Back from the provinces, Lognon said without looking up, still hunting the dead man's intentions. Maigret stopped. You'd be surprised how much noise a quiet man can make after he's gone. Lognon snorted, a small sound of acknowledgement, though he didn't look up again. Inside the office, Maigret laid the parcel on the desk and slowly unwrapped the charcoal drawing again. The man at the desk, the window, the watching woman. He studied it not as evidence but as a kind of confession, not in words but in composition. There was no malice in it, no plea either, just the eerie self-awareness of someone who understood that he had lived under a gaze he had not earned and had still been forgiven. Maigret retrieved the photograph from his coat pocket, the same one from Laurent's flat. Again his eye drifted to the woman at the end of the table. Madeleine, just visible in profile. But what held him this time was not her. It was the man beside her. He had never focused on him before. Older, balding, not smiling. Looking not at the camera, but down, at the table, at his drink perhaps. And something about him, familiar. He searched the original will in the folder Castan had provided, the first one, the one that had left everything to Juliet and no one else. The signature page, witnessed, 2 names. One, Maître Castan himself. The other, Henri Lavigne. Maigret sat back in his chair. Henri Lavigne had been a minor functionary in the Ministry of Finance. Retired now, a ghost of bureaucracy. The kind of man who existed in margins, in stamps, in approved but never discussed annexes. If anyone had helped Laurent maintain his second life, it would have been someone like Lavigne. Maigret made 2 calls, one to the ministry to confirm Lavigne's retirement status, the other to an old friend at Internal Affairs who owed him a quiet favor. By morning he had an address. The apartment building on Rue Traversier was plain and narrow, overlooking a street that buzzed with the energy of early deliveries and late breakfasts. Maigret waited until just past 9, then rang the bell. The man who answered was in his 70s, sharp-featured, with an expression both polite and guarded. He wore a beige cardigan and smelled faintly of shaving soap. Monsieur Lavigne. Yes? I'm Maigret. Lavigne's face didn't fall. It didn't even flicker. But Maigret saw the pause in his breath, just enough to know the name meant something. I'd like to speak to you about Émile Liron. Lavigne stood aside without a word. The apartment was quiet, furnished like a hotel suite from 2 decades ago. A table with 4 matching chairs, a sideboard with no liquor, a neat pile of correspondence beside a brass lamp. I assume this is about the will, Lavigne said, and about the names. Yes. Lavigne sat down, folded his hands on the table, and said nothing. Did you help him assume his identity? Maigret asked. No, Lavigne said. But I helped him keep it. Maigret nodded. Why? Lavigne looked out the window. Because I owed him. Owed him what? Lavigne gave a bitter smile. A truth. I was part of the department that buried the original investigation, the fraud, the dead colleague. We cleaned the file not to protect Laurent, but to protect the ministry. We didn't want the scandal. Laurent should have vanished. Instead, he survived. Did he blackmail you? No, never. He never asked for protection. But when I discovered he had resurfaced under a new name, a new life, I watched him. I made sure nothing resurfaced. So you kept his secret? Lavigne nodded. And when he wrote that second will, he asked me to witness it. It wasn't about legality. It was a gesture, as if to say, I am what I've made of myself. Not what I... Do you think he was content? No, Lavigne said quietly. But I think he found a kind of peace in his own terms. Maigret stood. Thank you. At the door, Lavigne said, Do you believe he did wrong? Maigret paused. I believe he did harm, but I also believe he spent the rest of his life trying not to do it again. And then he left. The next morning, Maigret returned to Castan's office on Rue des Batignolles. The lawyer stood as he entered, wearing a different tie but the same wary formality. You've been busy, Castan said. I've been listening. Castan offered him coffee. They sat. I'll write a memorandum, Maigret said. A private one. Nothing criminal. Nothing to disturb the terms of the will. But it should be kept in the file, for the family. For the record. Caston nodded. And the niece? Mudre looked out the window. She doesn't need to know the whole story, but she should know that her uncle was not careless with his legacy. He left it to those who knew him best and judged him least. Caston folded his hands. Will that be all, Inspector? For now. As Migray stepped out into the drizzle once more, he felt no triumph, no conclusion. Only a subtle quiet, like the end of a long sentence. A sentence not meant to end in a period, but in a breath. The rain returned, soft and unhurried, settling over Paris like a tired coat. It tapped against cafe awnings, beaded on balconies, ran in slender threads down the windows of parked cars. It was not the kind of rain that drove people indoors, only enough to make them move more slowly, to fold their collars up and tilt their heads down. The kind of rain that made you thoughtful. Migray sat beneath the green canvas awning of a quiet cafe on the Rue de Bourgogne, not far from the Assembly. He liked this place. It was out of the way, with fewer waiters than usual and more patience than most. His beer had gone warm, but he hadn't touched it yet. It wasn't about the taste. It was about the weight of the glass in his hand. Across from him sat Juliette Leronde. She hadn't wanted to meet. Not at first. She'd said, on the phone, that she had no interest in the past, that she didn't want some policeman's theory about her uncle. But she had come, and now she sat there, hands in her lap, her face unreadable but not unkind. You said you had something to tell me, she said. Migray nodded. I finished my inquiries. Was there something wrong with the will? No. It's valid. Maître Castan will confirm it. She looked past him, toward the rain. Then what is this about? It's about your uncle, he said. And what he tried to do in the last months of his life. She gave a faint, dry laugh. He left money to strangers. That's what he did. Not strangers, Migray said. Not really. She looked at him now. He left it to people who saw him, not as he pretended to be, not as the world believed him to be, but as he was, a lonely man with a past he never stopped regretting. A man who remade himself, not for gain but for escape. He committed fraud, she said. Yes. Nearly 40 years ago. He lived under another man's name. Took a position he wasn't entitled to. Then he disappeared. Not into wealth or power, into routine, into anonymity. He became the most forgettable man in the room. She didn't respond. Her fingers tightened on the edge of her coat. 3 people received gifts from him. Migray continued. A young painter who reminded him of his own false start. A housekeeper who gave him dignity without asking questions, and an old inspector who knew even then what he'd done, and chose not to ruin him. And me, she asked. You were his family, his last tether to the world he was running from. He left you the most, not because you loved him, but because you stayed. You returned, every Wednesday, with kindness and coffee and restraint. She looked down, as if ashamed. You never asked him what he had done, Migray said. Why? Because I didn't want to know, she said. I thought if he was hiding something, it was his to carry. I wasn't owed an explanation. You were right, Migray said. And that's why he left it to you. The cafe's door creaked open behind them. The waiter brought another coffee, placed it silently beside her, and disappeared again. She stared at the cup a moment before speaking. So he was a coward. No, Migray said gently. He was a man who chose to live quietly after living wrongly. He hurt someone. Yes, and perhaps he feared facing that. But he didn't hide forever. Not really. She said nothing. The rain ticked louder now, bouncing from the rim of the awning. There's a drawing, Migray said. He made it years ago, sent it to someone who had once seen through him, a woman named Madeleine Carreo. She never opened the parcel until I brought it to her. What was it? A man at a desk, and a woman watching him through the window. Juliette said nothing. I think that's how he felt. Migray said, that someone was always seeing him, not punishing him, just knowing, and maybe that's what he needed in the end, to be known. quietly. The silence stretched between them. I don't know if I feel sad or relieved, she said at last. You don't need to feel anything, Maigret said. That was his choice. He finished his beer. It had no flavor left, but it marked the time. Rain slowed a little. The traffic along the street moved like a slow river, its lights smeared and golden on the wet stones. What happens now? She asked. Nothing, he said. There's no case, no file, only memory. She stood then, buttoned her coat, and looked at him with something close to gratitude. Thank you, Inspector. He nodded. She left without hurrying, her umbrella still folded in her hand. Maigret stayed a little longer, watching the rain. He thought of Laurent, not the banker, not the fraud, but the man who had once spoken softly in a gallery, once shared silence with a woman he could not confess to, once left pieces of himself like markers in the lives of strangers. There had been no crime to solve, only a life to understand. And now that it had been understood, Maigret felt the case close, not with a slam, but with the hush of a file sliding quietly into a drawer. He lit his pipe and sat back as the clouds began to lift. Across the street, a boy tugged his mother's hand and pointed toward the sky. Regarde, maman, le soleil. The sun broke through, thin and reluctant, but it was enough.